Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now before we move on from the Ryzen 5 5500 X3D, I want to make one more comparison, this time against the Ryzen 5600. This is a suggestion I've seen in the comments a few times now. So the 5500 X3D has proven so far to be a pretty decent gaming processor thanks to its 96 megabytes of L3 cache. Both of these chips have 6 cores and 12 threads, but how will they compare when it comes to gaming? Before that, let's take a look at a quick DaVinci Resolve render test, because here the results are actually quite interesting, or not what I was expecting. So the 5500 X3D was actually slower than the 5600. I say not expecting, but from our test the other day I should have seen this coming really, considering the 5500 X3D has a lower all-core boost speed of 3950 MHz. It wasn't just slightly slower than the 5600 in the rendering test, it was a few seconds slower, but of course the 5600 has a higher 4450 MHz all-core boost. Let's get into the gaming now, and we'll start with 007 First Light, perhaps the closest result of the day. Here we saw 98 FPS from the 5500 X3D with a 1% low of 69, very nice, and a 0.1% low of 50. The 5600 scored 90 frames per second with an identical 1% low and a slightly better 0.1% low. I'm using the 4070 Super as the graphics card today, and I'm testing at 1080p, of course, to make the most of these processors. Battlefield 6 up next, and this is where performance was significantly more noticeably different between the two CPUs, with the 5500 X3D coming out on top as expected with a whopping 146 frames per second. I took the opportunity on my search for a vehicle here to actually benchmark the game, and I ended up with two similar runs, which was good. So 146 for the 5500 X3D, 117 for the 5600, which is still a pretty good result. The percentile lows, however, were also much improved on the X3D chip, 101 and 90 compared to 87 and 74. So a nice uplift here indeed. For Crimson Desert, well, here you may notice the 4070 Super hitting closer to 100% GPU utilization, a lot more, and that just means that the 5500 X3D, being the better chip so far, can actually utilize more powerful graphics cards. So if you're thinking about getting one of these, you're not sure whether or not to pair it with a sort of higher end card, you'll have a better chance of maxing out said card with this CPU than you would with the 5600, and that is shown by this result here. That said, when we do get closer to busier areas such as towns or cities, you will still notice dips below 90% utilization for the X3D chip, but it's going to hold up better than the 5600 here, which saw a lot more dips to that utilization, and therefore we can see that there is a more clear CPU bottleneck for the older 6-core 12-thread CPU. But again, I think it's a pretty solid effort for both, and considering the 5600 is cheaper, it's fair enough. Cyberpunk 2077, 1080p with the high settings. For the X3D 5500 we saw 106, a 1% low of another very nice 69, and a 0.1% low of 53, so pretty consistent overall here. This was improved over the 5600, which scored 87 FPS. It got a 1% low result of 56 and a 0.1% low of 47. So again, it's a consistent result for this chip, and that 0.1% figure wasn't too different from the 5500 X3D. Both will exhibit a few little dips here and there in and around those busier areas, especially if you have the crowd density option set to high, like I've done here. I'd recommend medium crowds with either of these. Next up we have Forza Horizon 6, really enjoying this one so far, and just like in Crimson Desert, we definitely saw more moments whereby the 5500 X3D allowed our 4070 Super to hit closer to full utilization. That said, there were also moments where we saw CPU bottlenecks, and the multi-competitor race that you're seeing on screen here is one such example. Of course, bottlenecks are good in terms of a comparison video because it allows us to better highlight differences between the performance of two CPUs. The 5500 X3D here performed with 16 frames per second better on average during this multi-competitor race, and the percentile lows were improved as well. or the 1% lows I should say, 97 up from 89 with the 5600. That said, the 0.1% low was actually slightly better with the older non-X3D chip, but during actual gameplay, this isn't a difference you're going to feel. I felt a couple of little stutters using both chips, especially in and around the city, so just bear that in mind. We'll finalise with a quick clip from GTA 5 Enhanced with the Max RT preset here. Again, the 5500 X3D pulling out in front with 114 FPS, up from the 5600's 85, so a very significant difference here. The percentile lows were also noticeably improved, and this is certainly a difference you're going to feel when actually playing the game. Now, I have seen a couple of listings for the 5500 X3D, but availability does still seem scarce. I've seen them on AliExpress and eBay. I've seen them on eBay UK and eBay US, and the price difference between them is going to depend on where you're looking, where you live, and what site you find them on. The 5600 I think is still a very solid choice. I'd definitely recommend it for a lower cost socket AM4 build. You want a cheaper AM4 build that you compare with DDR4. I paired mine, both of these in fact, with 16 gigs of 3200 MHz DDR4 for today's video. So I wanted to go with something fairly realistic, but I also went with the 4070 Super just to make sure that we could squeeze the most from these chips, and I dare say that in some cases the 5500 X3D still had a little more to give. I thought it didn't make sense in pairing it with anything higher end though, because I probably wouldn't go with anything higher than the 4070 Super with either of these, and you're probably not looking at a card like this, to be honest, if you do have this sort of budget for a more entry level AM4 chip. But it's up to you. The 5600 is going to be right at home with like a 4060, 5060 or an AMD 9060, something along those lines, but you could certainly get away with something more powerful with the 5500 X3D. It's continued to impress me, to be honest, and it's nice to see that AMD are still launching chips for this old platform, especially at the moment when prices of basically everything is just insane. It's certainly nice to have more choice, and the 5500 X3D is essentially a cut down 5600 X3D, which I think was exclusive to Micro Center, which I think is like a place in the US. We don't have those here, and that itself was a cut down version of the 5800 X3D. So yeah, can't go wrong with these X3D chips. I have noticed, however, that the 5800 X3D, the top tier X3D chip on the AM4 platform, is really expensive these days, even on the used market. I'm not sure if availability is decent worldwide or not, but this just makes me more glad that we have X3D options at the more budget friendly end as well, though it would be nicer to see a wider availability on those too. But as always, thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts down below, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.